First, I would like to welcome everyone to this webinar. Then to say thank you to LTP for inviting GS1 to be the moderator. It's an honor to us. The main topic that we will discuss today will be how can the data that flows within the value chain be used to improve the fast-moving consumer goods companies' performance. And to answer that, we will have António Filipe from Symington Family Estates. António holds a degree in the economics from the Faculty of Economics of Porto University and an MBA from EJE Atlantic Business School. He's currently a member of the board of directors of the Porto Wine Shippers Association and of the Interprofessional Council of the Douro de Marquez region, as well as board member and chief operating officer of Symington Family Estates, a producer of Porto and Douro wines for more than 135 years. And from LTP, Bernardo Almada-Lobo, with more than 15 years of experience developing and applying advanced analytical models, solving problems in process industries, fast-moving consumer goods and retail, with a special focus on operations management and marketing. As a co-founder and partner of LTP, he has also co-developed the strategic plan and vision of the company, the establishment of partnerships and the strategic business development. Bernardo is also a full professor at Industrial Engineering and Management, FIUP, and a member of the board of INESC Tech Technology and Science, as well as a member of the board of trustees of Fundação Belmiro de Azevedo. Myself, my name is Artur Andrade. I'm the head of industry engagement at GS1 Portugal, and I will try to moderate this webinar as the best as I can. So the speakers will talk about 5 major challenges for the companies in fast-moving consumer goods sectors and how data-driven state-of-the-art techniques can help solving those business challenges. We will have the opportunity to see real case success stories that we hope can inspire all the companies here today. We want to have a very dynamic session, so you can use the Q&A or the chat functionality to put all the questions that you may have during the webinar, and I will share them with the speakers. So let's start, and I hope that you enjoy the next hour with the 3 of us. Bernardo, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Artur. Not only for the introduction, but also for the willing to partner GS1 with LTP Labs. I'd like also to thank António for his availability. It's always a pleasure to discuss this type of topics with you, António. So the fast-moving consumer goods are somehow struggling to grow and to keep acceptable profit margins. And there are a set of issues that are taking place and that are enforcing the whole sector to readapt quickly. I'm talking about issues such as private label, digital marketing, new lifestyles, shorter life cycles, even the rise of marketplaces. And in order to cope with this change and to stay ahead of the game, this sector needs to use advanced analytics to remain competitive. And this will be actually the major topic of today's webinar. And when we look to this landscape, the companies, they are somehow focusing on 3 main domains: trying to know the consumer, trying to excel in operations, and try to stream the supply chain. FMCGs, they need to be able to identify and react quickly to the changes and preferences of the consumer. As we all know, the consumer is more empowered than ever currently. The consumer is seeking for information, is conscious about living, about eating, And actually, we need to really be able to model this consumer behavior. Additionally, in terms of operations, I mean, we need to be as efficient as possible. We need to plan our resources the best way we can to be able to manage variability, to be able to manage the disturbance that might occur, to deal with new digital technology, automation, in order to increase as much as possible operations performance. And finally, the third domain has to do with the need to have an end-to-end centric supply chain. Supply chains are more granular. And it's funny that when we look back 10 years ago, supply chains were a kind of cost center. So everyone was just looking to supply chains as a way of increasing efficiency. And currently supply chains are an experienced driver to test the connection with the consumer. And actually these three domains, I think they are transversal as key points of any company in this sector, including the wine industry. Right, António?
Yeah, well, actually, it's quite interesting, Bernardo. First of all, thank you very much for a very kind invitation. And thank you also, Artur, for actually trying to sort of to extract the best of us today. But you are absolutely right. You know, I totally relate to these three levers, as you call them, of knowing the consumer, excelling the operations, and streaming supply chain as the most relevant levers that you can actually deal with in today's world to have a successful company. That's in terms of the knowing the consumer. That's really what everybody is looking and trying today, to have access to as much information as possible from their consumers and their customers. As somebody said, you know, every single company around the world, and in particular the ones that deal with and they are in the business to consumer area, they always sort of they want to have the opportunity to spend a day in the life of a customer, or if that is not possible, then use an app to do that. But this is something which not everybody does agree. I do agree, but you know, but going back a few years, Henry Ford said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses and not cars. And even more recently, somebody like Steve Jobs said, we will just build them first and fast and get feedback later. Customers don't know what they want anyway. So really, I don't see myself, and I don't relate to these ideas, but I think it is really important to find a balance, and find a balance between knowing the consumer and knowing what the consumer is after. But it's also important, and I would like to introduce that theme here, knowing yourself. And I mean knowing yourself, I mean knowing your company. The why, the what, the how of the Simon Sinek's golden circle. And funny enough, what my experience tells me is that consumers and customers, they also want to know what and why do you exist and what do you stand for. So I think I would go for a balance here between knowing your consumer, but also allowing your consumer to know you better. Excelling in operations, I could not agree more with this view. Actually, we have invested as a company, Symington has invested heavily over the years in order to be better and better in operations. We say a lot of times that we need to have all ducks in a row. And another sort of famous phrase that we use is that the devil is in the details. And we truly believe that. And we truly believe that in order to excel, we need to do the big well, but also the small, the detail well. In terms of the streaming of the supply chain, well, for a company like ours, that sort of poses some limitations. You know, there's a challenge. I would say a general challenge with traditional activities. There's a rigidity in the distribution that we are facing, in particular in the distribution segment of the value chain. Legal barriers, taxes, and labelings, and so it's not always easy to find opportunities of streaming your supply chain. We do believe that that we should continue to invest, and we are investing in promoting visibility across the value chain with our suppliers, but also with our customers, and identify opportunities of vertical cooperation as well as horizontal cooperation. Vertical with suppliers, for instance, and we have a number of EDI programs with both our suppliers and the customers, but also with our competitors, studying things like, for instance, buying platforms. Bernardo?
Yeah, António, actually, it's interesting that you talk about this type of partnerships. We're going to be back to this point sooner, especially try to think about how we can actually partner with competitors. But some of the 5 challenges that Artur mentioned at the beginning, some of them are more marketing and sales oriented, others are more operations oriented, and others are somehow in between these two areas. So either growth or efficiency. And the first one has to do with the competitive landscape that we currently witness, and that calls for commercial aggressive strategies. And when we look to this landscape and to the position of the different competitors, we should look at this with lenses from the demand side and from the supply side, in order to somehow then model and develop analytical models to support sales management decisions. So in terms of the demand, we are talking about trying to model customer behavior, trying to understand the decision process of customer. What are the factors that actually interfere with this decision? And then trying to look from a supply point of view, what is the impact in terms of OEE, overall equipment efficiency, in terms of the production disruption, in terms of the stock that we need to have a certain service level. And in terms of the degrees of freedom that we have a set of them. I will focus now, I'll give a couple of examples in terms of how to set the price for each product, customer, and channel within trade programs. And one of the things that analytics can help us is to try, based on the past trade deals that we have, to try to understand what are the drivers, what are the factors that somehow have influenced in the past trade sales volumes. Now, when I talk about factors, I'm talking about the depth of the discount, which was a distributor, the month, the brand, the merchandise, the channel, and all these factors, they might feed an analytics engine that is able to, in a very granular way, SKU, channel, day, trying to measure and quantify the impact of each of these drivers and factors on sales and sales elasticity. And these type of models that are quite sophisticated, they allow us to do 2 things. First, they allow us to be able to look into the past and try to understand, why did we have a sales uplift? What were the impact and the contribution of each of these drivers? And based on this client behavior from past deals, we can explore insights for the new deals upfront. And to give an example of what we have done in a tobacco producer, this company works under a highly competitive and sensitive market. In tobacco industries, you know, there is a lot of substitute products, so the density of this substitution is quite high. And what we tried to do, we tried to somehow be able to help in this pricing optimization using not only internal data, but also data from consumer and market research. And we combined both to evaluate consumer behavior. And what we actually did, we ended up having a model, a pricing optimization model. First, we tried to forecast price elasticities, the substitution behavior between between products. So every time I increase the price of one product, this will affect the demand of the remaining products. And then we optimize the prices. And it's interesting because we include here game theory. So we try to include in our models, whenever we change a price, how is our competitor going to react? And we include that behavior into the model to be more realistic. And this, of course, allows us to do a lot of scenario exploration. António, this price issue is also quite important in the wine industry.
Well, I cannot speak on behalf of the wine industry. I can speak in a little bit for the port industry, but the fact is, obviously, the pricing policy plays a absolutely fundamental and crucial role in our management set of decisions. You mentioned on one of the, I think on the previous slide, you mentioned the power of distribution as a rigidity factor of these sort of models, and I agree with that. I think that the power of distributors, and that obviously depends on the FMCG and the market that you are working. You know, I would say that there's just various types of FMCG products, and with different approaches. But the power imposes limitations to these sort of models, and in particular when you work on a B2B to C basis. And that sort of brings in the question of being a price maker or a price taker. And unfortunately, in a lot of these products that this industry has got, there are a lot of companies which are basically price takers. I use the Symington family states example because I don't think that we are doomed to be price takers, and I think our company is a good example of that.
But sorry, does it have to do with also with private label?
It does. It has to have with brand building process and moving away as much as possible of private label. You know, I would say that we would be a price maker when we sell Nubli at 8,500 euros a bottle, and probably we would be a price taker when we go and negotiate with Tesco for Ruby Port on their private label. So yes, you know, we have that dual position of being a price maker in some areas and a price taker in others. We would be clearly a price maker along with our competitor tailors in the vintage port industry and segment of this industry. So yes, and in that sense, I think analytical models could play a very important role in helping to break down the price structure of the value chain and help identify opportunities to capture value. I think that these models could help us a lot. The holy grail of these sort of process, in my opinion, would be that eventually you would be able to set up one price for each and one individual price for each individual consumer. As for instance, when you go to an auction and you sell Domaine de la Romanée Conti, a sort of famous Burgundy house, and you sell that particular bottle to that particular customer. Obviously, that would be asking a little bit too much of the models, but ultimately everybody has different expectations and different desires and different ideas of what the price of the product should be. I would just add one thing that I feel that is becoming more and more important. Past information is very relevant, and we are the living proof of that because we use LTP's models in our planning process. But I think we in the future should try to move towards including subjective variables and information on these models. I don't know how, you know, you probably you could answer that, but what we are seeing in our industry is that we have more and more people not buying only because of the price, not only because of the brand value, not because of the intrinsic qualities of the product, but because what they like what the product stands for. A few months ago, Symington gained the recognition of an entity called B Corp. This B Corp gives accreditations to companies that adopt the logo using business as a force for good. And quite surprisingly, we got a lot of people asking us, who are you? What you sell? What is your product? I would like to taste it. I have never tried port wine in my life, but I love B Corps and I love the B Corp concept. So being able one day to introduce these subjective variables into the models would be.
But we are not. Sorry, Artur. No, you are muted. Just while you were mute, António, we are not far away from that point. Okay, so what you were suggesting was a way of trying to combine what we call thick data that might come from sentiment analysis, from what beyond the attributes of the product. I think that your message was beyond the product itself. What are the key things that make us more touched to a certain brand or a certain company, the values, and then so what actually ultimately what you're trying to do is to really model the behavior of the consumer. And actually the models really try to combine what we call thick data, that is this data that is not so so large scale but is more in depth, small sample but more in depth, to really try to understand how does the consumer behaves. We then try to cross-fertilize this data with what we call big data, so what we have in historical data. Sorry, Artur.
So, well, for sure, you are on mute will be the phrase for 2020. So I'm sorry about that. Now, I have just a quick remember to all the participants. You can interact with the speakers through the Q&A or chat function. Wrote your questions, and I will share them with the speakers. I have just one question for António, but as well for you, Bernardo. We are seeing models. What flexibility can we expect from these models when, for example, faced with extreme situations like the current pandemic situation? Does the human being have to be prepared to take control of the situation in extreme cases, or are the models strong or flexible enough to respond to these extreme situations?
Well, in our experience, and probably Bernardo will hate me for the rest of his life for saying this, but our experience shows that some degree of supervision and critical evaluation needs to be brought in. In particular, when you are in face of extreme events like Brexit and COVID and others alike, this could obviously change in the future as artificial intelligence develops and is brought in. But in extreme events like these, like sort of Brexit and COVID and others similar, I think some degree of supervision is needed.
But I do, António, I do not hate you about that, because I do agree with you. Actually, I mean, of course, you want the models to react as fast as possible and to learn as fast as possible to a new type of event. But during the event, you need to have specific knowledge domain from the people of the company to really control the joystick, and in that transition is quite important. But come on, we also need to be honest here. In this period, even human being were completely lost about what to do in terms of the forecasts and preaching. Now, the second challenge that I would like to bring here has to do with somehow a misalignment between the customer needs that we were talking about and the available portfolio. And actually it's clear that FMCGs, they need to rethink somehow their portfolio priorities. So where do they want to play across brands, across categories, across channels? And we know actually how the companies, specifically those companies that are really brand oriented, how do they work? So they are quite proactive, launching new products. The new products might come from R&D investments, from niche strategies, but we know that this type of NPD brings a lot of new products to the assortment. But then we also know that it's quite painful for companies in this sector to delist an SKU, and this has to do a lot with governance issues. But of course, there is, when we look to different categories, what's going on is that the higher growth in terms of product range is not having the same growth in terms of the sales. And the impact is that the sales per SKU is decreasing. And this actually is going to somehow make the efficiency of the whole supply chain much more difficult. And we have seen actually quite nice examples of companies that are trimming their product lines with very nice impacts in terms of the growth of revenue. But what we should keep in mind, in terms of the governance, is that if we want to make decisions in terms of portfolio and product range, we should be able to look on one hand to the market and to the way we model demand and the way we anticipate the consumer reaction to a product extension or trimming, and also what is somehow the cannibalization or the impact in terms of a category when we introduce a new product. But then we need also to have into account what are the supply chain costs. We need to simulate operations. We need to anticipate whether we are going to have additional costs when we extend the portfolio, or whether we're going to have savings when we somehow trim the portfolio. And this trade-off between increased sales volume and somehow the surplus, the excess of cost, is something that you need mathematical models to be able to help you. Of course, having in mind that the governance is quite important on this. Actually, we have done this in several companies, and one of the issues has to do with the granular information. So we tried to do this in an FMCG company, and the challenge was to try to define the product range for over 1 million outlets, so very small stores around the country, and in order to somehow, on one hand, reduce the distribution costs, and on the other hand, to try, of course, to somehow increase the share of market. And the approach, they have to be quite exhaustive in terms of the way you model the forecast, the way you model the everything around the consumer behavior in terms of product substitution, in terms of the way you forecast and the way you segment your customer within the scope of the company. And then you need to somehow be able also to model the costs of the distribution, the costs of the whole supply chain, and be able then to cross both in order to suggest how you should actually then fine-tune your decisions. Actually, this issue of not being able to kill SKUs, I have not yet found any FMCG company that did not have this painful process. António, are you the first one not to have this issue, or do you also feel that it's quite, and you are more from operations side, is really hard to kill SKUs?
No, that's unfortunately the clear answer is no. Yeah, well, as you say, everything is more complex. You know, consumers are more demanding and expanding their sort of concerns, and different areas, they are actually less prone to accept that the product does not sort of meet the expectation in terms of performance. You know, just if remember that in the past, people they would find it sort of normal if you broke a cork when you remove it from a bottle, it would be totally acceptable. Nowadays, it's not acceptable. We get people that actually bring the product back to the point of sale because they say, well, the bottle does not fit my wine cabinet, so they return it. So you know, that's becoming really more complex, and this sort of brings in the need, in order to meet the expectations of your customers, of your consumers, the need to innovate. Now, in an industry like the port wine industry, innovation, I'm not saying it's not impossible. On the contrary, I think it's very possible, but it's difficult. It's difficult in the sense that it is an extremely regulated industry. Port and Douro and the wine industry in general is extremely regulated, extremely complex in the different categories that it shows, and that sort of it's a limitation to innovation. Now, with the need to innovate, and we have innovated in several areas. You need to constantly monitor the performance of your portfolio and identify the non-performing items, and that sort of normally leads to a very big frustration. And I would emphasize this word, the frustration between commercial and production. I think it has to do a little bit with the governance or processes. So who actually is in charge of looking into the non-performance items and on the need to streamline your portfolio and your product range, because normally it tends to be commercial. Even if you bring in limitations and constraints like sort of sales over 2 years, like we do, and gross contributions or net contributions like we do of product, there was this sort of thing that, you know, ultimately we need this product because it's important for the strategy that we have in relation to this customer or that country, and so on and so forth. So there's always sort of a discussion which tends to sort of lead to frustration on one side and the other. So in that sense, bringing in data and hard data and analysis to the process, I think, is helpful to remove frustration in a process which will never be perfect, but it has a lot of room to improve. I think you mentioned something like sort of the product life cycle management. I think it is an extremely important point, which is not normally addressed to companies. You know, we have to go back to the beginning of the process of each new SKU and understand, okay, what is the logic? What were the promises of these products back then, 2, 3, 5, 10 years ago? Have these promises been met or not? So bringing in data to the discussion and data that you cannot challenge, I think is extremely important and beneficial to this very frustrating tension point in companies.
If I may, Bernardo, we have one question from the participants, and I would like to add one more, a little bit related what António was mentioning. The participants, one of them asked, can this type of models estimate the impact of the competition introducing a new product or product line? And I would like to ask, because we are talking about getting data, in your opinion, are we really going to be able to reach the reality where the consumer leads or commands the creation and conception of the products? And if so, what the organizations and the companies needs to do to listen the consumer? And António, if you want to go first, and then Bernardo, if you have to add something, please.
Well, as I said at the beginning, we are not sort of, we're trying to find the midway, you know, we are not trying to please everybody, But we are obviously listening to our consumers, and we are just not sort of producing our products in the closed room just to please the people in the production department or on the tasting room. You know, I continue to believe that there's a balance between the two of doing something which you feel that the markets and the consumers will like, but something which also addresses their needs and their expectations. We cannot go as far as losing our identity, the message that we convey to our consumers, and actually not be able to show the best qualities of the produce, and in particular of the region. For us, authenticity and origin are clear USPs, and we cannot compromise them. So the answer is we need to find a balance there.
Yeah, I do agree that we should be parsimonious when we talk about targeting and when we talk about extreme customization. António said something before as having one price per consumer, and I mean we could extend it to have one package, one label per consumer, and of course, I mean it's not reasonable. But what we should actually try to do, we should try to extend somehow the typical customer, very broad segments that companies use, and to have more granular information, and to try to adapt. And this information actually, Artur, your question on the competition data, you should try to include if you have it. It's not only about aggregate data about what is the portfolio of your competitor, but you then have to look in terms of the brand power of your competitor, and also in terms of geographical areas, because the power of a certain brand might not be the same across different geographies. But if you have that information, of course, for sure, you should try to include. Actually, the previous case of pricing that I showed to you, we try to anticipate that somehow the response of the competitor to a certain price dynamics. Now, let me go to the third challenge, and this challenge is currently quite dramatic. So we have been watching unprecedented uncertainty in the current context, and this actually impacts supply chain decisions. And actually, in case of António, I think he has the perfect storm. So on top of the COVID-19 situation, he has to deal with Brexit. So I can imagine that the two simultaneously, António. How do you manage risk?
Well, we don't. I'm just kidding. We just we just hold hands and pray that this is going to go away sort of real quick. No, the circumstances are sort of difficult, really. You know, we have this Brexit issue coming in quite soon. We have had actually 3 Brexits in the last 3 years, because we have anticipated 3 times the Brexit sort of through creation of stocks and other measures, and apparently now is going to happen. The consequences are going to have to be substantial. The UK is wanting to create labeling constraints and impositions which will make it impossible to sell the products that we currently sell in the UK that we are selling in other markets. We will not be able to in the future to do that. So that is increasing cost into the operation and complexity, because the number of SKUs are going to increase. Then the change in the configuration of the most important distribution channels we have, with concentration movements, mergers and acquisitions, and the advent of the ultra-modern distribution, like sort of the Alibabas and the Amazons of this world. The COVID, obviously, it has had a huge impact in our operations. Incredibly enough, the fact is that we have not suffered as we were expecting back in March. And on the contrary, the sales the performance of the company this year have been actually quite Interesting. Why? Because we expected that everybody would sort of just not buy. And the fact is that people, because they are home a lot more time, they have probably less to do. They go to the supermarket and they bring them sort of a nice bottle of wine for themselves. And that has been sort of really good news. The other thing which is clear to us at this point is that we are looking at the deglobalization process, in the sense that markets, countries, are setting up barriers and higher barriers. You can use legal barriers, fiscal barriers, but the fact is that this is going to have a huge impact on the way we do business, for once, and secondly, and also not less important, in our operations, in the complexity of our product range, in the extra complexity of our planning process. This is going to have sort of major impacts.
Yeah, it is true that some companies, somehow the on-trade channel almost disappear, and the off-trade somehow absorb part of the demand, and the direct-to-consumer flow also somehow compensates somehow. But we are currently, what we are seeing is that the environment is quite volatile, and under such circumstances, what you do need to do is to be able to have a very fast decision-making cycle. So you need to be able to make decisions faster, to be able to experiment faster, and to be able to react faster. And we should do it in several domains. One that I'm not going to talk has to do with the design of the network, the way you should adapt your flows. We could talk about the current pain in terms of the last mile delivery, specifically because of this Horeca crisis. But I will focus on the zero-based budgeting and an S&OP. So the idea is that, I mean, you should be able not only to do this decision-making cycle faster, but to do it more holistically. So you should try, under these circumstances, you should try to somehow map all the functional areas of the main functional areas of the company. I'm talking about production, I'm talking about procurement, distribution, and sales. And then you should be able to try somehow to optimize, to model somehow the whole mapping. What I mean by model, trying to link the demand drivers with the costs and performance of the operations. And then we can see here in the middle, what you should try to promote is this what-if process, in which you start having demand scenarios to address uncertainty. And companies now cannot just work with one scenario. They have to work with several scenarios that might appear, to be able to have a very fast way of generating optimal plans to this scenario, to be able then to evaluate the plans and to keep doing this cycle very fast, so that they can somehow make the typical S&OP, sales and operations planning, more dynamic than ever. And it's crucial that you somehow try to integrate the different functions within the company. Of course, I mean, it's the way you should integrate, and the level of integration, it depends on the setting of the company. But for instance, if we are working under very tight capacity settings, it is fundamental that you do production planning simultaneously with sales and marketing plans. And also the way under very short capacity, you should bring pricing into also production planning, because as we know, pricing you might shape the demand. In other situations, you should do procurement of raw materials simultaneously with production planning. But the key idea is that you need to be very efficient trying to project the different scenarios, demand that might take place. I'm talking typically about the tactical planning, yearly planning that also supports budgeting operations. And then you have to think about what are my degrees of freedom in terms of operations, in terms of line indication, shift adjustment, and so on. And then you need to optimize plans, and you need to be able to have a very detailed and granular view of the KPIs, and doing this quite frequently. And if you do this quite frequently, what will happen is that you will try somehow to mitigate the gap between tactical planning and operations and more short-term planning. You have currently a gap in organizations, and actually you can benefit then from platforms, from analytical platforms to do this quite proficiently. And if you are able to do this in a very short running times, you then can somehow signal the organization whether you should go more for a certain category of products, or whether you're going to have a service level issue or an OE issue. And this actually somehow is enabled by the use of the advanced analytics, supporting this budgeting and an S&OP type of problem. So, but the key point here is actually this integration of the different functions. So how can we actually integrate? Yeah.
One of the conclusions of what has happened over the past few months is that when we have sort of a crisis like this, you tend to eliminate all the limitations that you had in terms of stock levels, of finished products, in terms of the stock levels of raw materials, and in terms of the decisions that you do. You just free up all the constraints and increase your degrees of the number of your degrees of freedom. And when we have sort of this big crisis, suddenly the tendency is to throw money to your process to ensure that you are as safe as possible. And I think here the clever idea to say that we can achieve the same result without having to throw all that money into the process, just to be on the safe side. I think what I have sort of seen is that it is really easy to something which was forbidden a few months ago, and say, well, there's a no, we cannot spend money on that. Then suddenly it becomes, okay, let's do it, let's spend it, So analytics, I think, could play a role in ensuring that we just do not throw money at stuff.
Yeah, when you say throw money, we're always talking about buffers, where to inject the buffer. And we can do this analytically by trying to quantify the uncertainty. We are not eliminating the uncertainty. We're just trying to quantify the uncertainty and then have a holistic way of injecting the buffers in the most suitable places of the supply chain.
Yeah, but can I provoke the both of you? Are the Portuguese companies prepared for this necessary flexibility? For example, to adapt to the VUCA concept, where the markets are inserted right now? And if not, what change the companies need to implement in order to be flexible? Because we are seeing that flexibility will play a key role in order for companies survive, in order to speak in the market. So, António, in your opinion,
well,
we are prepared to be flexible.
I would say some are, and in particular in the Portuguese wine business, there are clearly a lot of players that have a lot of experience, both in the Portuguese market and as well as abroad. This is a small industry, the wine industry in Portugal. My estimate is that this is not worth more than 1.6 billion euros. But of that 1.6 billion euros, we export about 820 million over 100 countries. So we have a lot of experience and flexibility in terms of addressing different needs of different markets. We are a smaller fish in the big pond. There's a huge pond of wine in the world. Normally, the world will produce around 260 million hectoliters a year. We produce 6 million hectoliters a year. So we are not sort of a big player in this market. But everybody's producing great wines around the world and quite cheap wines around the world. There's a big change in the way people live and people feed themselves, and how conscious they are about their health and their lives. There are less countries now where we can sell compared to what we could sell in 1960. Take, for instance, Iran, where we actually sold wine there, and we can't sell nowadays in even Indonesia, in other countries. So yes, I think we have a lot of experience, and in the Portuguese wine business. I mean, I don't know about other businesses, and we are, you know, we have this sort of capacity to be quite flexible, which is a characteristic of the Portuguese people. Now, flexibility, I think, is the key word. Flexibility in operations, innovation, digitalization. They do have to assume the leading role in management decisions without losing sight of our unique selling propositions. And I would include all Portuguese ones in here.
Yeah, and actually, let me build on top of the last sentence of António, because if we are talking about flexibility on top of a process that allows us at each point in time to decide what is the best course of action to take in order to cope with a certain unexpected event, I do agree that that sort of flexibility is quite important. If we talk about the typical Portuguese word desenrasca, flexibility, that I don't buy that type of flexibility skill. But of course, we need to have a way of having a rationale to make flexible adjustments in the way we react. And one size does not fit all, so this is what we should keep in mind. But again, the models might help you taking these sort of decisions.
I'm sorry because I think it's an important question. I know we are probably a little bit short of time, but just a quick answer to one of the participants that asks: does zero-based budgeting allows to test subcontracting options versus internal production?
Yeah, yes, it does. So whenever you are scarce in terms of capacity, you might either do it with increase the number of shifts internally, and you might have some flexibility, but then you cannot always try to understand, given seasonality, given your capacity profile, whether it is worth trying to subcontract. And it's not only subcontract in general. When should you subcontract, to which plant, which line, everything integrated simultaneously so that you can have the best output from the model. Yes, we can. Now, I will be very briefly in terms of this fourth challenge, because we actually have talked today a lot about it, about these silos in terms of the organization, and what we do need to do in terms of trying to somehow bring the best of the commercial team into the planning team to have somehow a common ground in terms of the way we anticipate the future. It is well known that some companies have quite strong sales forecasting processes within the financial department or management control department or commercial department, and then they have demand planning in supply chain teams or in planning teams, and sometimes they do not match each other because of different frequencies, granularities, and this is actually not very performant, because we're not taking into account the best of both worlds. And the best of both worlds is really trying to have a process in which we explore everything that we can do from internal data, everything that we can take from external data, and then also try to bring into the equation very powerful commercial insights that they have. And we need to bring everything all together to be able to do a very accurate sales forecast. One thing that I'd like to mention here that we do not take is about the possibility of having data partnerships with other businesses. I do believe that companies should start gathering data outside their own company, and by looking not only to the typical data from Euromonitor, Nielsen, INE, and so on, they can actually then do some partnerships in terms of data, even with not only vertical partners, but companies from the same layer in terms of the positioning within the supply chain. So I do believe that these might actually benefit a lot the type of models that we have. But since we have already talked about this, I would move to the last research challenge, not in terms of business challenge, and this has to do with the impact that the demand volatility and what we saw before in terms of having an extended portfolio is bringing into the operations. I mean, the operations are suffering. There is a tremendous impact in terms of the supply chain based on this volatility, on these reduced lot sizes. And we need to somehow understand what are the levers that we have in order to be able to perform better. And the key issue is that we should always try to understand what is the most interesting trade-off between a certain service level, OTIF, on time in full, and a certain operation costs. And we cannot put everything with the same trade-off. I mean, you need to segment. You need to segment your channels, your customers, your products. Don't try to use the same supply policy to all the different channels and customers. And then you need to somehow, after you decide where you want to be for each segment, you should try to somehow understand how can you play around with a planning that is integrated, looking in terms of production strategy, in terms of resource planning, in terms of inventory management. And each one of these levers, I mean, they then have somehow a model to allow us to define what is the ideal output for a certain product. For instance, whenever we think about production strategy, I mean, we have companies that are completely full MTO, make to order, other that are more make to stock oriented. But for sure, and based on the different characteristics of the demand profile and of the characteristics in terms of operational point of view, for sure there is the most interesting mix between these two strategies. Even for instance, there is an intermediate situation, the make to pack, that is quite used also in the wine industry. António may talk about it. Is actually to produce in advance the product up to a certain stage where the product is still undifferentiated, and only when the order comes in you try to do the packaging for the customer. Actually, we have done this in several situations, but my key message is to try to somehow understand first, what is the strategy of the company? Do you want to maintain the service level and your focus is to reduce costs, or do you want, given the current operation cost, you want to have a higher service level? And how can you then try to optimize this balance between the different production strategies, having in mind that you have to have typically in FMCG sales forecast together with known demand, and then you need to somehow convert these in production needs, and only then to production planning plans that you need to optimize. António, how do you play around with this production strategy, knowing that whenever we select a certain strategy, we are somehow trading off if we are having finished good stocks or more dry raw materials stock? How do you play around with these production strategies?
Well, it is an extremely and complex process. We have to separate here two things. The first one is the wine, the liquid, and the second is the finished product or semi-finished product. I mean, the bottle with or without the label, with or without the carton. In terms of the wine, it is an extremely complex exercise that only a few companies have been close to master it. And we have our models, but the fact is that they are very difficult to be perfect. Just think about, we now have to decide today what the sales of 40-year-old of Symington are going to be in 40 years. So this is how complex the whole thing is in terms of the liquid. What we try to do basically, just to put it very, very simple, which is not, is that we prepare the lots or pre-prepare the lots in such a way that they can be used with subsequent blendings. They can be used in different types of products. We try not sort of to commit to a certain customer or a certain type of product without being 100% sure that we will be able to bottle it and we'll have orders and we'll be able to sell them. So basically what we do is try to, sort of to take a step back and go as far as possible in terms of the blending process, in terms of the preparation of the wine lots, until a sort of a decision is made to actually bottle them. In terms of the production, the big problem we currently have is how to balance three things: the stock of finished goods, the stock of raw materials, I mean bottles and dry materials, bottles, labels, and so forth, and production costs. And how can we create a model that actually allows us to sort of first transfer the amount of finished product we have to raw materials, and in total have less investment on both, whilst at the same time optimizing the production cost, which is extremely sort of variable and dependent on the production levels. You know, 1,000 cases of port in the bottling line will cost 10 times or 15 times less than 100 cases. So yes, this balance is a very, very, very challenging process.
Can I, Bernardo, can I just ask one last question? Yeah. And we are talking about this. So in your opinion, António, and of course Bernardo as well, can AI, artificial intelligence, work with the existing data to balance the MTS-MTO ratio in a way that allow the amount of waste to be made residual?
My simple and short answer is, I wish. I'm very much looking forward to, actually, I pray all day for that.
My answer, it depends on the KPI you want to optimize. If you want to minimize the waste, yes, it is possible. This type of artificial intelligence models, they are flexible and dynamic enough to cope with different KPIs, different objective functions. The issue is whether actually companies are willing to have just that single objective function, because you have to, as we all know, you have to balance with other type of KPIs. I mean, just to finish, this is the last slide. I mean, we were talking about here examples and challenges where the message was that we should try to look holistically to the challenge with ambition, think global, and then we should start very focused, small, and then scale fast. We should try to do this in every possible challenge. But for that purpose, we should have somehow a roadmap for the analytical needs that a certain company has. And for that purpose, we try to come up with a analytics assessment so that the companies can somehow evaluate their initial maturity in terms of processes around strategy and organization, customer and sales, process and operations, and people and technology. And we have done this in partnering with Nova School of Business Economics. And so please try to feel this, so to have an idea, how are you currently in your analytics roadmap?
I don't know, any final remarks, António, Bernardo?
No, I think there's just a quick, there's a question here, which I see. António, can you please talk about how analytics improved operations at Symington? What is the most successful case study so far?
Yeah, sorry.
Very, very quickly, you know, we do have a number of projects going on, starting with sort of viticulture down to logistics. In the viticulture department, we had a really interesting, we have really interesting projects going on at the moment. One of them is actually has to do with the collection of data points in our vineyards in terms of the evolution of the vineyard over the year. And we have sort of robots that go along the vineyards to extract information on several parameters, which allows us, for instance, to manage the picking of grapes at the parcel level, at the lot level. And that has proven extremely successful in terms of optimizing the picking plans in our different properties. Also, sort of information on weather and rain and temperatures, which has helped us also make sort of really relevant decisions in terms of planting. And also a project that we have developed with LTP, with helping us with our forecasting tools, and that's been sort of proven to also quite successful. So we tend to say to ourselves that we are a company with history. We are not an old company, and hopefully this is going to be true in the future also.
Artur, just my last comment has to do with the fact that analytics is just one piece of the puzzle, right? So we have talked today a lot about processes, and you need really to bring both together. So you need to somehow think about the way you are going to change processes in such a way that they have a smooth adoption and internalization of the things that we are developing. Otherwise, the impact is null. All right, so processes and analytics in order to promote change management in companies.
Okay, very good. So with this, we finish our webinar. We hope that all the information, data, examples, share can be used by the organizations here today in a way that helps to overtake the business challenges that all of us have daily. I would like to say thank you once more to António and Bernardo, and for all the knowledge shared today, and of course LTP for inviting GS1. So thank you everyone, and stay safe.